The studio lights hummed softly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the cramped radio booth in downtown Chicago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in 1964, and the air outside carried the crisp bite of early autumn, with leaves beginning to turn golden across Michigan Avenue. Inside WKRZ's main broadcasting room, the atmosphere was anything but warm. Gerald Patterson sat behind the microphone, his perfectly pressed suit jacket matching his perfectly rehearsed skepticism. At 42 years old, Gerald had built his reputation on being the voice of real music. The classics, the standards, the songs that his predominantly white middle-class audience trusted. He adjusted his headphones with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, his fingers tapping impatiently on the console as he waited for his guest to settle into the chair across from him. The station manager had insisted on this interview, claiming it would bring contemporary relevance to their afternoon programming. Gerald had other words for it, none of which he'd say on air. The walls of the studio were decorated with framed photographs of past guests, crooners in tuxedos, orchestra conductors with batons raised, jazz musicians from the so-called respectable era. Not a single photograph showed anyone who looked like the man now sitting across from Gerald. James Brown sat down slowly, his posture upright despite the tension crackling through the small space like static electricity. At 31, he had already transformed the music landscape, though you wouldn't know it from the way Gerald's eyes kept drifting to the clock on the wall. James wore a sharp burgundy suit that caught the light just right, his processed hair immaculately styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his appearance spoke of dignity earned through relentless work, the kind of work that took him from shining shoes in Augusta, Georgia, to stages across the country. But he could read a room better than most people could read a book, and this room was telling him a story he'd heard before. The engineer behind the glass gave a thumbs up, the on-air sign flickered to life in angry red letters, and Gerald Patterson leaned into his microphone with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Good afternoon, Chicago. This is Gerald Patterson, and you're listening to the Afternoon Standard on WKRZ. Today we have with us James Brown, a performer who's been making quite a bit of, well, let's call it noise, on the rhythm and blues circuit. The pause before noise was deliberate, surgical, designed to land like a punch wrapped in politeness. James didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been warned about Gerald Patterson. Other performers had sat in this same chair, faced these same thinly veiled insults, and left feeling smaller than when they arrived. But James Brown hadn't built his career by shrinking. The interview began like a slow-motion car accident that both men could see coming but neither could stop. Gerald's questions came wrapped in velvet condescension, each one designed to highlight the supposed gap between legitimate music and what James represented. "Now, James," Gerald continued, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, "your performances are quite energetic, some might say chaotic. I'd say, how do you respond to critics who suggest that what you're doing isn't really music in the traditional sense, that it's more about spectacle than substance?" Outside the studio windows, Chicago went about its business. Businessmen hurrying to lunch meetings, secretaries on break feeding pigeons in the plaza, a street musician playing saxophone for spare change. The city was a symphony of different sounds, different rhythms, different lives intersecting and diverging in the great urban dance that defined American cities in the 1960s. But inside that booth, only two sounds mattered: Gerald's practiced dismissiveness and the quiet calculation happening behind James Brown's steady gaze. James leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table between them, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every stage he'd commanded, every audience he'd moved, every barrier he'd pushed through. "Well, Gerald," he began, his southern accent coloring his words with warmth that contrasted sharply with the host's clipped Midwestern tone, "I appreciate you having me here today. I really do, but I think maybe we need to talk about what music actually is." Gerald's eyebrow arched, and listeners across Chicago heard the barely concealed amusement in his response. "Oh, please, enlighten us." The sarcasm dripped like honey laced with arsenic. What Gerald Patterson didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he sat there in his comfortable chair, in his comfortable studio, speaking to his comfortable audience, was that he was about to become part of a story that would echo far beyond that Tuesday afternoon. The station had been struggling with ratings for months. Younger listeners were tuning out, finding their music elsewhere. on stations that didn't treat new sounds like threats to civilization. The owners had brought in a consultant from New York who had used words like demographic shift and cultural relevance, words that made Gerald's stomach turn. This interview was supposed to be a bridge, a way to acknowledge the changing landscape without actually changing anything fundamental. But Gerald had his own plans. He would expose this noise for what it was, demonstrate to his loyal audience that standards still mattered, that not everything new was worth celebrating. He had prepared his questions carefully, each one a trap disguised as curiosity. "Your music, if we can call it that," Gerald pressed on, his voice taking on the tone of a professor correcting a particularly slow student, "seems to rely heavily on repetition, the same phrases over and over. Some might argue that shows a lack of musical sophistication. What's your response to that?" James smiled then, a small knowing smile that didn't interrupt the host, but somehow filled the space between them with something Gerald couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. James had learned long ago that anger in these situations only confirmed what people like Gerald wanted to believe. It wasn't defeat. James Brown had never been defeated by anything except maybe time itself, and even that was still up for debate. The studio felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were listening too. Through the glass partition, the engineer, a young guy named Marcus, who had actually seen James perform at the Regal Theatre last summer, watched with increasing discomfort. He had tried to warn Gerald before the interview started, tried to tell him that James Brown was different, that dismissing him would be a mistake. But Gerald had waved him off with the same condescending gesture he probably used on everyone under 30. Marcus adjusted the levels on his board, making sure every word of this train wreck would be captured in crystal clarity. Outside, a police siren wailed past on State Street, its sound Dopplering into the distance like a warning nobody heeded. Chicago in 1964 was a city of contradictions, gleaming skyscrapers rising above neighborhoods still scarred by old wounds, integration happening in law but not yet in hearts, music pouring from radios and record players that reflected a country trying to figure out what it wanted to become. In the booth, James uncrossed and recrossed his legs, a small gesture that somehow communicated more patience than Gerald deserved. "Repetition," James said carefully, "is the foundation of every great musical tradition in the world. From African drumming to European classical music, from gospel to the blues. The question isn't whether you repeat. The question is what you do with that repetition, how you build on it, how you make people feel it in their bones." Gerald's smile tightened. This wasn't going the way he had planned. His audience liked their explanations simple, their categories clear. Music was either good or it wasn't, civilized or primitive, worthy or worthless. But James Brown was speaking with the confidence of someone who knew things Gerald had never considered, had never had to consider. "Interesting theory," Gerald replied, reclaiming his authority through tone alone. "But theory and practice are different things, aren't they? I mean, I've heard your recordings, screaming into a microphone, grunting, making sounds that barely qualify as words. How is that musical?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Even through the radio waves across kitchen tables and car dashboards throughout Chicago, listeners could feel the shift. Some leaned in, curious to hear how this would play out. Others reached for their dials, uncomfortable with the tension. And a very few, smiled, because they recognized something Gerald Patterson didn't. He had just made a terrible miscalculation. James Brown didn't lean back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Gerald Patterson with eyes that had seen poverty and triumph, racism and redemption, failure and resurrection, and he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly who he was. "Those sounds you call barely words," James said, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "Those are feelings that don't have words yet. When I'm on that stage, I'm not just singing. I'm channeling everything that people carry inside them, but don't know how to express. The joy, the frustration, the hope, the struggle. Every grunt, every scream, every sound you think isn't music. That's the realest music there is." Gerald opened his mouth to respond, but James wasn't finished. The engineer behind the glass sat up straighter, his hand hovering over the delay button just in case, but something told him this wasn't going to be a problem. This was going to be history. "You want to know about musical sophistication," James continued, and now there was steel beneath the velvet of his voice. "Let me tell you about the Apollo Theatre in Harlem. Let me tell you about playing for audiences who work 2 jobs just to survive. who face rejection and disrespect every single day, who come to my shows because for those 2 hours, they can feel like somebody. They can feel powerful. They can feel free. When I hit that stage and give them everything I have, when I fall to my knees from pure exhaustion and they have to throw a cape over my shoulders and drag me off, that's not spectacle, Gerald. That's communion. That's church without walls. That's music doing what it's supposed to do, changing people's lives. The silence that followed was deafening. Gerald Patterson, who had an answer for everything, who prided himself on never being caught off guard, sat there with his mouth slightly open, his prepared questions suddenly feeling flimsy as tissue paper. Outside the window, Chicago continued its indifferent dance, but inside that studio something had shifted irreversibly. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, though the studio clock showed only 7 seconds had passed since James Brown finished speaking. 7 seconds of dead air on live radio, a cardinal sin in broadcasting, the kind of mistake that got people fired. But Gerald Patterson wasn't thinking about his career in that moment. He was thinking about the last time he had felt this off-balance, this exposed. It had been years ago, maybe decades. The engineer behind the glass, Marcus, watched with wide eyes as his board's VU meters barely flickered, capturing only the ambient hum of equipment and the almost imperceptible sound of Gerald's breathing. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop on Michigan Avenue. Passengers boarding and departing in the ordinary rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon, completely unaware that inside the building above them, something extraordinary was unfolding. Gerald's fingers found the edge of his note cards, the carefully prepared questions that now seemed to belong to a different interview entirely, questions for a different person, maybe even a different version of himself. He cleared his throat, the sound crackling through speakers across Chicago like a confession of uncertainty. "I see," Gerald finally managed, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The smoothness was still there, years of professional training couldn't be undone in a single moment, but underneath it, listeners could hear something new. Doubt, perhaps. Or maybe just the beginning of understanding. James sat perfectly still, his hands still folded on the table, his expression neutral but not cold. He had said what needed to be said, and now he waited, the way he had learned to wait as a child in Georgia, as a young performer in clubs that didn't want him, as a recording artist told his music was too black for mainstream radio. Waiting was its own kind of power when you knew your worth. Gerald shuffled his papers again, a nervous habit disguised as professionalism, and glanced at the clock. They had 23 minutes left in the scheduled interview slot. 23 minutes that suddenly felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, deciding whether to step back or jump. "You mentioned the Apollo Theater," Gerald said, his tone shifting from interrogation to something that almost resembled curiosity. "I've heard stories about that venue. They say the audience there is demanding." James allowed himself a small smile. "Demanding doesn't begin to cover it. The Apollo crowd knows music, real music. You can't fool them with studio tricks or pretty faces. You either have it or you don't. And if you don't, they'll let you know before you finish your first song." The conversation began to transform then, like ice slowly melting in spring sunshine. Gerald asked about James's early performances, and for the first time he actually listened to the answers instead of just waiting for his next opportunity to strike. James talked about the Chitlin circuit, the network of venues across the South and beyond where black performers could work, often in conditions that ranged from barely adequate to actively hostile. He described playing shows in tobacco warehouses, high school gymnasiums, anything with a stage and an audience willing to pay. He spoke about the countless hours of practice, the band rehearsals that went until dawn, the relentless pursuit of perfection that drove him to fire musicians for missing a single note. "People think what I do is improvisation," James explained, leaning forward slightly as the passion crept into his voice. "They see the energy and the spontaneity, and they assume it's all just happening in the moment. But every move, every sound, every transition, that's practiced 1,000 times. I don't believe in winging it. I believe in working so hard that when you get on that stage, perfection looks easy." Gerald found himself nodding, caught up despite himself. This wasn't the narrative he had prepared for. He had expected to expose a fraud, to reveal the emperor's new clothes. Instead, he was hearing about discipline that would make a military officer proud, standards that exceeded those of many classical musicians he revered. Outside the studio, the Chicago afternoon continued its slow march toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the plaza. Office workers began the mental shift from work to home. In apartments and houses throughout the city, radios played on kitchen counters and workshop benches, and people who had tuned in expecting Gerald Patterson's usual superiority found themselves listening to something different. Phone lines at the station began lighting up, but the receptionist had been told to hold all calls during live interviews. She scribbled messages on pink slips of paper, her handwriting getting messier as the messages piled up. Some callers were angry. "What is this garbage?" one woman demanded, but more were curious, intrigued, even moved. A mechanic in Bronzeville paused in the middle of an oil change, wrench in hand, listening. A housewife on the north side turned up the volume and called her sister. "You need to hear this." A college student studying at the library pulled out his earpiece and just stared at his transistor radio, processing what he was hearing. The ripples were already spreading, though no one in the studio could see them yet. Gerald glanced at his remaining questions and made a decision that would have shocked his program director. He pushed the cards aside. "Tell me about your audience," he said, and this time there was no sarcasm in the request. "Help me understand what happens at your shows that I'm missing." James paused, considering how to explain something that lived in feeling rather than words. "Have you ever been to a church service, Gerald? A real one, where the spirit moves through the room like electricity?" Gerald shook his head slowly. His Sundays were spent at a Presbyterian church on the Gold Coast, all decorum and dignity. Hymns sung from hymnals in voices carefully modulated to avoid excess enthusiasm. "Well," James continued, "that's what my shows are, every single one. When I'm performing, I'm not trying to entertain people in the way you might think. I'm trying to take them somewhere. I'm trying to give them an experience that transforms them, even if just for a few hours. When I drop to my knees on that stage, when I scream into that microphone, when I push myself until I can barely stand, I'm showing them that it's okay to feel everything. All the pain, all the joy, all the anger, all the hope. That's not noise, Gerald. That's liberation." The words hung in the air like incense. Marcus, behind the glass, had given up pretending to check levels. He was just listening now, his hand still, his attention completely absorbed. Gerald Patterson felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not quite shame, not quite revelation, but something adjacent to both. "I owe you an apology," Gerald said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. They tumbled out before his professional filter could catch them, before he could calculate the implications. "I came into this interview with my mind already made up. I thought I knew what you were, what your music represented. I was wrong." James didn't respond immediately. He studied Gerald's face, looking for sincerity, finding it mixed with confusion, and something like grief for a certainty lost. "I appreciate that," James said finally, "but you don't owe me anything. You owe it to yourself to open your ears. Really listen. Not just to my music, to all the music you've been dismissing because it doesn't fit your categories. The world is changing, Gerald. Music is changing. You can either change with it or get left behind, still arguing about what counts as real while everyone else moves on." The truth of it hit Gerald like a wave. He thought about the consultant's reports sitting on the station manager's desk, the declining ratings among younger listeners, the advertisers asking questions about audience demographics. He had been so focused on defending his standards that he hadn't noticed the ground shifting beneath his feet. "So what do I do?" Gerald asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. "How do I bridge that gap?" James smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You start by respecting that there's more than one way to make music that matters. You don't have to love everything you hear, but you have to acknowledge that just because something is different doesn't make it less legitimate. Those grunts and screams you talked about earlier, they're as valid an expression of human emotion as any aria ever sung in an opera house, maybe more so because they're raw and honest and unfiltered." Gerald nodded slowly, processing. "And if I wanted to help my audience understand this, to introduce them to your music in a way that might actually reach them, you tell them the truth," James said simply. "You tell them that music isn't about following rules. It's about breaking them when the rules get in the way of feeling. You tell them about the work, the discipline, the craft. But most importantly, you tell them to let go of their preconceptions and just feel it. Either it moves them or it doesn't, but they have to give it a fair chance." The clock showed 8 minutes remaining. Gerald made another spontaneous decision. "We have a few minutes left," he said, looking directly at James for perhaps the first time since the interview began. "Would you be willing to do something unprecedented? We have a record player in the studio. Would you choose one of your songs, play it for our audience and walk us through what we're hearing? Help us understand it." James's eyebrows rose slightly. This was unexpected. Radio stations like WKRZ didn't play his music. They barely acknowledged it existed. But here was Gerald Patterson, the voice of musical conservatism in Chicago, offering him a platform. "I'd be honored," James said. Marcus scrambled in the booth, pulling out the station's small collection of R&B records they kept for reference, but rarely played. He found a copy of Please, Please, Please and held it up through the glass. James nodded. As the record spun up, its first notes crackling through speakers across the city, James leaned into his microphone. "Listen to that opening," he said. "That guitar line. It's simple, repetitive, like you said earlier, but it creates a foundation. It's a heartbeat. Everything else builds on that. When I come in with the vocals, I'm not trying to sing pretty. I'm trying to communicate desperation, longing, need. The repetition of please isn't because I can't think of other words. It's because when you really want something, when you really need something, you don't have other words. You just have that one word over and over, with all your heart behind it." Gerald listened, really listened, maybe for the first time. He heard the pain in James's voice, the way the band locked together in perfect synchronization, the way the song built to its emotional crescendo. It wasn't the music he grew up with. It wasn't the music he had spent his career championing, but it was undeniably music, undeniably crafted, undeniably powerful. When the song faded, Gerald spoke into the sudden silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, that was James Brown performing Please, 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 and I have to tell you honestly, I hear it differently now than I did before this conversation." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I started this interview with condescension and arrogance. I'm ending it with humility and respect. Mr. Brown, thank you for your patience with my ignorance and thank you for your passion. You've taught me something today that I needed to learn." James extended his hand across the table. Gerald took it, and they shook, not the perfunctory handshake of professional courtesy, but a real connection, acknowledgement passing between them like an electrical current. "Thank you for being willing to listen," James said. "That's all any of us can ask." As the on-air sign flickered off and the afternoon jazz program's theme music swelled to fill the space, Marcus came out of the booth, shaking his head in amazement. "Mr. Patterson," he said, "the phone lines are going crazy. The program director wants to talk to you immediately." Gerald sighed, already imagining that conversation. But as he watched James Brown gather his coat and prepare to leave, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, excited about what came next. 3 days later, Gerald Patterson's afternoon show added a new segment, Sounds Beyond Standards, where he explored music outside his traditional format. Bringing the same intellectual rigor he applied to classical music, to jazz, R&B, soul, and emerging rock and roll. The ratings climbed steadily. His audience didn't abandon him. They grew, adding younger listeners while keeping the loyal older ones who appreciated his honesty about his own evolution. James Brown's career, already ascending, reached new heights. That Chicago interview became legendary in music circles. The day a skeptic became a supporter, the day respect was earned, not through confrontation, but through authentic conversation. The recording of the interview was played in journalism schools as an example of how to conduct yourself when proven wrong on air. Music magazines wrote articles about it. Young performers studied it, learning that dignity and knowledge could win over hostility better than anger ever could. And in studios and living rooms across America, people began to listen differently, to question their assumptions, to open themselves to sounds they had previously dismissed. The change didn't happen overnight. Chicago in 1964 was still a divided city, still struggling with the same tensions that gripped the entire country. But in small ways, in individual moments, bridges were being built. Music was doing what it does best, finding common ground in shared emotion, proving that beauty and power come in many forms. Years later, when Gerald Patterson retired from broadcasting, he kept one photograph on his desk at home, James Brown and himself, shaking hands in the WKRZ studio, the on-AIR sign glowing red above them. He never forgot that Tuesday afternoon, when a 5-word reply, "That's the realest music there is," changed not just his mind, but his entire understanding of what music could be and what it could do. James Brown continued to evolve, to push boundaries, to create music that moved bodies and souls. He never forgot the radio host in Chicago who had the courage to admit he was wrong, who transformed an ambush into a conversation, hostility into mutual respect. The lesson resonated far beyond that studio, beyond that city, beyond that moment. That growth requires humility, that understanding requires listening, and that the most powerful changes often come not from grand gestures, but from simple willingness to hear what we've been refusing to acknowledge. In the end, what Gerald Patterson learned that day was what James Brown had known all along. Music isn't about fitting into categories. It's about breaking down walls, including the ones we build inside ourselves, and sometimes all it takes is 5 honest words to begin that transformation. The afternoon sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and in apartments and houses throughout the city, radios played on, carrying voices and rhythms and songs that proved over and over again that there was no single definition of what made music real. There was only the truth of what moved human hearts, and that truth came in as many forms as there were people willing to listen.